I think without further ado, I invite up the Prime Minister to defend the motion that stands with their name. Here.
All right. I'll just do this. Let's see. All right. 3, 2, 1. The Rwandan genocide was incredibly tragic, and we on Opening Government think that forcibly displacing people out of their land into poor villages is far worse than the alternative. Firstly, what is the counterfactual? Two things I want to promote here. One, the returnees come back to the rural villages that they previously were in. This looks like the lands that they were in for generations. But secondly, if they are to move to these villages, in the long run, it would probably be for different reasons. So we think that on either side of the house, they are going to probably move to these villages just in a different way rather than being forcibly displaced. This looks like market reasons. So if they want to get a better job or an education, these are the reasons that they are likely to move to these villages anyway in the long run, rather than forcibly displacing them in the status quo right now. The reason the Rwandan government does this right now is to probably create some amount of lessened conflict and more state buy-in in the long run and to accomplish, some amount of state buy-in. The problem is you just can't do this as fast as the Rwandan government wants. And there are several reasons for this. Firstly, these villages are going to be incredibly poor. So the Rwandan government, regardless of the reimbursement programs that they actually have, are not going to be able to create these villages properly. This looks like villages that are going to be quite corrupt. These are probably going to be places that don't have proper, proper institutions that, creating these villages really quickly would require. It requires intense amounts of investment from the Rwandan government to do so. This means incredible trade-offs for the annual budget that the Rwandan government needs. This means that lots of people who in the Rwandan government need things like social welfare and stuff, they are taking away active money to build these villages rather than naturally allowing them to accrue over time. Secondly, this means that forcibly creating a village is often bad. You can also just create market inefficiencies. So this looks like people, generally people move to different places based on, if they get a better job and stuff. Right now, if you forcibly try to move people into these areas, this means that you are going to get, maybe too many lawyers in one area or something, or too many people of one particular trade and you're going to create too much market inefficiencies that way. And so not enough people are going to be, create a specific market segment there. Okay, what were these rural areas like? One, there's like your family, your tribe, and your culture was there for a significant period of time. So people have a deep-rooted affiliation to these rural areas. But secondly, religious and cultural affiliation to the land that they are from. So it is quite literally sacred to them to return back to these places. They have not just like deep-rooted cultural, it's like it's a spiritual thing that they actually genuinely care about this land rather than creating fake villages for people. Okay, two cases for you then. Firstly, why you get more state buy-in on our side of the house, and secondly, why you get more ethnic conflict in the long run on their side. Firstly, on state buy-in, why do we need actual state buy-in in Rwanda? After the Rwandan genocide, Rwanda lost a lot of political trust, not just amongst the Hutus, but also just generally across the world. So lots of people didn't really necessarily trust the Rwandan government to handle its own, rebuilding its own government. But secondly, the Rwandan government is also quite corrupt and it's also quite poor. So it requires trust from the people actually obeying the laws of your country. It requires people genuinely wanting to, build businesses, trust your education system, things like that. These are generally quite important for when you need for trying to rebuild a state. But secondly, this means that if you don't do this, people don't do things like participate in politics. This means that politicians can be incredibly populist. They can go towards one segment of the population. You get worse kinds of politicians in office, the more corrupt kinds. But secondly, when people don't open businesses because they don't trust the government to handle their regulations properly, this means certain people are favored more. They're given more money. They're given more lax regulations. When people don't trust the government, people don't oftentimes open up businesses. They don't often buy land or buy homes because they genuinely fear the government more for fining them for moving to specific places. But thirdly, when people have a hard time trusting institutions, they always feel like they are outside. They genuinely just feel like they're psychologically going to be othered by the government. They are going to be forcibly moved at any point. And this is the problem here. You're setting a precedent for lots of people who are being forcibly moved from these villages, or forcibly moved from these areas into these villages, as if that the government actively, is not, is actively hating them. Why is state buy-in important? Firstly, you need long-term government stability. So, like when more people participate in politics, people then actively trust your institutions. This means that people are more likely to do things like open businesses, more likely to seek out an education, more likely to, cooperate with the government in the first place. These are things that are incredibly important for the Rwandan government. So a stable government, a stable government is going to be less corrupt in the long run because Rwanda and the status quo is probably more corrupt. And the reason you get even more corruption is probably also because certain ethnic groups are likely to take over the government far more than other ethnic groups because they have a precedent to do so. They've been there for an incredibly long period of time. They're probably incredibly wealthy. In this case, particularly the Tutsis. And at worst, in the counterfactual, people are going to move for particularly different reasons. So even if this happens in the long run, anything that Op says about long-term development of Rwanda, this is still going to happen because people people in the long run tend to urbanize anyway, because most people want to seek out better opportunities, get a better education regardless, because they want to provide for their families and stuff. Yeah.
Do you know who the leader of Rwanda is right now and how popular they are?
I kind of don't. Okay. Anyway, secondly, on ethnic conflict and why you're likely to get there in the long run. Why do you not actually get, on ethnic conflict? When you forcefully put multiple groups of people who don't like each other, in this case, the Hutus and the Tutsis, who have just come out of conflict, like the conflict just just ended in the past few decades. These were people that killed your people and tormented you for a long period of time. This creates an active hate within the actual village for people who, they killed your family and stuff. They killed your, whatever, your businesses and stuff. You don't trust the government right now because you believe that the government is actively against you, even if you return to them right now. The problem here is that this, firstly, exacerbates the state buy-in problem when people don't feel like they can, reasonably live amongst other people. But secondly, in the long run, you create greater amounts of resentment because the government is just forcing you to move from place to place. So this just means that the government, you feel like anger towards the government, you feel anger towards the other people who are like surrounding you. This looks like more people, forming different coalition groups and whatnot. This creates more civil conflict in the long run, where civil wars are more likely. We think that a more natural form of displacement is far better on our side of the house. No, not right now. I actually don't know what my timer is at. But anyway.
4 minutes, 37.
Well, no, this is. Oh, thank you. Yeah. We think that forcibly displacing people is probably likely to create more long-term resentment. And this long-term resentment is far more certain. What I mean by this is when you forcibly displace people for a longer period of time, people are going to have this resentment. So their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren are going to have this for a severely long period of time. They're going to feel like the Rwandan government actively hates them. On the counterfactual, this is less likely to happen because when people move naturally differently, when people live in these rural areas, they're less likely to, interact with other groups of people in the long run. And so they are more likely to know people of their own villages. The problem is when you move for specific reasons rather than being forcibly moved for like an education and stuff, you're there for a specific goal. And so you're there for, achieving a better job or getting a better education. So you're less likely to, interact, or like, even if you do interact, you're likely to interact in a positive way. So the kind of social contact you get on our side of the house is going to be more positive, insofar as the other people that you see are going to just be your peers or your coworkers, rather than people who have genocided you or killed you for a significantly long period of time. On our side of the house, you get a better Rwanda in the long run, you get more long-term stability, and you get less ethnic conflict. With that said, project proposal.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for a fantastic speech. I invite up the Leader of Opposition.
Can I get you to displace? Thank you. Thank
I
you.
love how Zoom is like zooming in on your face.
Yeah, I know, it's horrific.
No, it's fantastic.
It like
It follows you around too. Wow. This feels like a TikTok edit.
God.
I have something. Don't worry.
Okay. It is astonishing how well Rwanda is doing post the genocide. The explanation for why this is true is simply this policy of, if I can find it where I wrote it on my page, villagization. I'm scared I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. I'm first going to explain why this was done well, both empirically and also through a variety of structural reasons. Second, explain why it was needed. And then three things. Firstly, on the economy, secondly, on militias, and lastly, some responsiveness to the small points we got out of opening government. Why was it done well? Firstly, a variety of incentives at all levels of government to make sure that this policy was done in a way that wasn't primarily mass forced relocation. One, despite the tension that existed in the region, there was a broad incentive for people to cooperate. People didn't want to go back to the tensions that existed before. They wanted there to be peace. They didn't want to see their neighbors as genociders. They didn't want everybody around them to like feel as a threat. They wanted prosperous economic growth so that they and their families could be wealthier. They didn't want retaliatory violence. If they went to displace someone from their home, they might have a gun. They had to deal with that problem. And every individual, local government official and person on the ground, and also the leaders of the government, wanted their personal glory and fame. They wanted to believe that they were the person doing well. They wanted to be seen as the person who was doing well. The incentive structures put in place for these local government officials worked well, because the targets can't just be literally pick someone up and move them to a different place. They have to relocate. They have to live there now. This means that if you take them under duress and they are unwilling to cooperate, you have not really successfully matched your target. And also, it is just physically much harder to physically displace people to where you want them to go, instead of creating the necessary broad incentive to move them, creating the infrastructure that they want to see, etc., etc. Lastly, this is a moment when Rwanda has the entirety of the outside world looking in. Everybody is concerned. They're worried. They want to make sure that there's a clean resolution. Tons and tons of diplomats were flooding into the region. There was aid going in. Often it was conditional and worked with the government there to make sure that this policy was done well. Jaleelah.
Some large chunk of the land in what is now Israel was sold rather than acquired via forced relocation. Does that make the forced relocations that happened okay?
I'm going to weigh against them. I do think that in the end, it ended up being the correct decision. I don't think that there was a necessary counterfactual that would have worked very well. Why did they have the capacity to make these decisions properly? One, centralized planning is hard, but it's not that hard when the counterfactual isn't the villages that OG is defending, but scattered homesteads where people were subsistence farming, barely cooperating. There weren't hundreds of lawyers roaming around the rural countryside of Rwanda waiting to come into these villages. All you needed was some amount of infrastructure, some amount of planning of where people were going to live, some amount of cooperation on what sort of businesses were going to exist. There were technocrats in Rwanda, plenty of smart people, and the outside world could look in to help, offer aid, offer expertise. The last thing is that many things are just very cheap. It's just not that expensive to do a lot of this development. Lots of the labor in Rwanda is relatively cheap. Lots of the development of homes is a relatively cheap endeavor. And there's no counterfactual better use of this money. All of the money the Rwandan government had could have been spent here. Why is this needed? OG defends a counterfactual, which is just that, like, we let things happen, right? We don't do anything at all. They say this is extremely likely. CG can do their own thing. But with that in mind, one, for the reasons they've identified, people are tradition tied. They believe that they are, like, bound to this land in some meaningful way. Obviously, they don't believe it that much because they say that they're going to move willingly at some other point. So it's not really a tie to the land that's some principled right that's being violated because they would be willing to move in some counterfactual. Secondly, people fear the upfront move without payout. They aren't sure that if they move, there will be some centralized area where they will be able to prosper, and they're worried about the physical act of moving. These are two cognitive biases, which mean that people are reticent to move, even when it would be good for them in the long run, because they have to face this brief moment of separation from their land. This is why often it's insufficient to force people to do something. And secondly, if the counterfactual is just paying them to do something, I don't know why that's any different of a violation of their integral connection to this land. Money is as coercive as violence. Lastly, you need to plan for this influx. You need to be prepared for lots and lots of people to move to the places that you're taking them. It's not clear that this would have happened counterfactually if we're just letting the market solve in the ways that they describe. Firstly, the economy. The economy getting better matters for a lot of reasons. OG flags a couple of them, but generally people are happier when they have more money to buy more things so that they can fulfill their needs and their wants. It also cyclically makes the entire place better. It means that the government is more able to fund more products, develop better infrastructure, make people happier. Cyclical things that start earlier lead to being better. It can't be long-term, it needs to happen now. And also, in general, people being more financially stable makes them happier. Lots and lots of strife and suffering and hatred comes from feeling like you are being violated, like you aren't safe. Financial stability is one mechanism to make you feel safe. Why does centralization work? The intuition here is just what OG said, which is that everybody fucking wants to live in a village that is centralized so that they can economically prosper. We're just making that happen faster. More efficient allocation of labor. You don't have a million people who are all farming and then can't get their goods to and from each other. Instead, businesses can scale up in their smaller, denser villages to serve more people. And so more different people can specialize into their different areas of expertise. This both means that you're able to get interesting and creative goods that service more people instead of just having the bare minimum needed to survive. But it also means that everyone is more efficient because you're doing the things that you're actually good at. You're able to access the economies of scale that come from having more capital consistently flowing into what you are doing. There's more competition, which means that companies and businesses are prone to do better than they would if it was counterfactually just like random homesteads. This is the end game that they're talking about with the lawyers, which didn't previously exist, but could exist. You also cut down on a whole bunch of frictional costs. It is difficult to travel. It is difficult to do financial exchange when you are in scattered homesteads. This is why vast swaths of the world are still extremely poor, is because they don't have access to the markets that would buy the goods that they are producing. Lastly, so the implication of this, obviously, just people become richer, specialized, develop the economy better. This happens much faster. That's important. Secondly, on militias, I think rural homesteads would have exacerbated the problems that are discussed towards the end of opening government. Why? Because yes, it was a brutal period. There was still fear in the air, and there was reason to be afraid. Fear breeds violence. Every other person who's afraid of you has an incentive to move first to hurt you. But centralization resolves this in a couple of ways. Firstly, socialization is good. It is useful to see that the people you genocided or who genocided you aren't actually that different from you. This is how you get over that hurdle of feeling like they are an enemy to you. That only happens when you live with them, coexist with them, see that they are nice, do business exchange with them, which doesn't happen if you let people settle naturally, because they will settle in segregated ways because of this fear that exists. They will move to only exist with the Tutsis or the Hutus, and that will lead to the civil war that OG is so afraid of. It's very much protected time. There's also much more oversight. There are more police forces. There's a justice system. There are armies that exist, which means that the local homesteads can't band together with the guns that they have left over from the genocide to go attack other homesteads of the people that they disagree with. There is massively less violence, massively less tension, and massively more economic development. The counterfactual proposed by opening government is sure to be a disaster. At their best case, it happens much slower than us. So proud.
All right, can I use your timer on? Thanks.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for a fantastic speech. Invite up the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Yeah.
Is the DPM speaking?
No, I'm not. Sorry.
Okay.
Turn around. Oh, right. Recording button. Is that on?
No,
Yeah, no,
we're
we're good.
recording from-
Oh, perfect. Okay. I have given tentative consent to record, but maybe I revoke it later if I really hate my speech. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Let's deal with the LO's incentive claims. They claim that the government has tons of incentive to do this well. I think I have problems with this. I think they mistake the government itself for the actual people who are the officials who are enacting this policy. Maybe the government has tons of incentive to do this well. Fine. The problem is that the actual officials have a lot of incentive to do this very badly. There's two big reasons for this. First, often this is right after insofar as this was right after the genocide, these officials were in a time of large instability in the first place. So often this meant these officials had a very large incentive to look out for themselves in the first place. They were often quite scared for their family. This means two things. First, insofar as they are subject to penalties and fines, for example, from the government, or subject to privileges, they want to do this as fast as possible and in the worst way in the laziest way possible. They want to import as many people to the village as possible, as fast as possible, so they don't get fucking fined, and so they can maybe feed their families or whatever. Second, this means these people are also able to basically take some of the cool aid that OO talks about, insofar as now these people still have more control over the aid and the distribution. These people now get to siphon from this in the first place. No, I want to flag the implication of this incentive claim. First, this means that the diplomat stuff doesn't actually matter, because even insofar as these, I don't know, the government itself or the people in the government, maybe even if they really care and want to do well, the people on the bottom are always going to want to care about feeding their family first. Second, this means that these people end up doing this in the worst way possible and exacerbating the ethnic conflict problems that Hamza talks about. As in, often these people are going to be centralizing these villages insofar as where there's going to be Hutus and Tutsis very congregated close together, insofar as these people are not taking the time to coordinate these villages properly and ensure that communities are sticking together in the first place. Why is this really bad, and why does this ethnic conflict flip OO's capacity claim? Two reasons. The first reason is that now this means that these people are much more likely to exacerbate itself. And I want to make very clear why the LO's claim on incentive doesn't work. They claim that people have incentive they want the war to end, and they want these people to now all out, and these people all want to be kumbaya. The problem, panel, and I want you to gut check this, is that this is right after a fucking genocide. Maybe this would be true, for example, in the long run, but in the short term, when you place all these people potentially much closer together in the first place, this means these people are not going to be hold hands like LO suggests. They're going to fucking kill each other. But I hear you say. But LO says that now these people can do militias. Problem. These people, when these communities organize on their own, they're going to organize along these community lines in the first place, and they're going to be at a considerable distance from each other. So even maybe if there are some very bad elements of this, or maybe some malicious. No, it's actually much harder for them to actually attack others insofar as there's likely to be much farther away, and these communities are likely to be much more congregated. This gets much worse when these people are at each other's fucking doorstep. You probably get much more violence. Now, why does this destroy a lot of their claims on why you get better economic incentive outcomes, or why you did not get better economic outcomes? This is a regret question. Two reasons. The first reason is that insofar as a substantial ethnic conflict, this makes the actual business the investment you get much lower insofar as people don't like to invest in terms of when there's substantial conflict. This often means substantial property damage in the first place. You don't get these good outcomes because you don't want people, businesses don't want to set up as far as ethnic conflict, and certain businesses get bombed in the first place or whatever. Second, this also gets worse insofar as Hamza literally told you, you still don't have the capacity. Yes, they talk about funding good social programs or whatever. Cool. Hamza already explained to you why you already have good it's already expensive to set up these villages. Yes, we get that you have aid. You have aid on both sides of the house. When you are dumped, their response to why it's like why the villages aren't that expensive is just, trust me, bro, it's not that much money. Sure. Even if that's true, that's a comparative cost they have to afford. And when they have to dump monies into building these villages, often when they lack the capacity in the first place to make these services good, this means that now it's much hard to do the cool things that they talk about. The end impact is they make it much easier for people to substantially beef and have substantial ethnic conflicts with each other, and they make the actual economic outcomes substantially worse. Why is the comparative much better? Two reasons. The first, the likely comparative is that people eventually do in fact congregate along village lines or among community lines. LO says this was initially homesteads. I agree. The thing is though, is that people are going to want to congregate and head back to their old villages in the first place and reunite with old community members. So these people probably have substantial incentives to congregate together and actually congregate together in the first place. So this likely solves the problem they talk about on scattered homesteads. This likely would end up being like somewhat larger villages of people in these same communities. So this means these people are, one, less likely to be willing to attack other villages or other villages with other ethnic groups insofar as these villages are much farther from them, and there's likely to be substantial distance insofar as they interact. I'll get even 30 seconds. But second, this is likely to be done much better, and they likely have much better capacity to feed these people, to benefit these people economically on our side. Why? These funds are likely distributed much better. If you believe what LO if you believe what LO says about how, if they admit that it's logistically hard to plan for the central planning, it is probably somewhat easier insofar as you have more villages in the first place, or more villages that you are able to send some of the aid that we have to those other villages. Why is this likely to be redistributed? Actually, I'll ask the answer why it will be redistributed much better on our side, but first, CO.
Yeah, so clearly we're in an economically desperate situation. By the time you wait for your villages to naturalize on your side, people are probably already starving and suffering from economic destitution.
Yeah, just wait 30 seconds, little bro. First, the economics actually first, when this aid is sent to these villages and is organized by community leaders, it is likely done much better in a much more judicious way. Why? Because often after the war, when these people are in the same communities that they have, these people are after the genocide, these people likely feel stronger community ties with each other. As in, they probably just found old community members and family members they have not seen for ages. The people who are organizing this aid is likely going to be local community leaders who have strong incentives to benefit everyone in that village. This means that people are going to get. This means that this aid is going to be spent very well. It is going to be done to benefit most people. It's going to be done very basically equally. But the problem in opposition is that's likely to be distributed by people who are the bureaucrats that opposition talks about. People who are the problem is that these people do not actually have those same incentives. They lack the community ties that the local leaders have in the first place. This means that they're much more likely to be siphoning from the aid in the first place. The problem with this is that now these people in opposition are actually going to be starved in the first place because now these people are not actually going to be getting that aid properly because the government bureaucrats have incentive again to siphon that aid as far as a much more self-interested in the first place. The problem becomes that now you harm capacity on their side. Note, why do we win? What do you believe at the end of this debate? First, we win on the short term insofar as we won for substantial ethnic conflict and people don't die. And second, the aid is spent marginally better. In the long run, these people will be better anyways. But when we solve the short term as well, we're able to, I think, substantially be opposition part to propose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for a fantastic speech. Invite up the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close out the front half of this debate.
Yeah.
I'm going to start with some rebuilding on why the police force or whomever's doing this relocating isn't going to likely to do it badly. They're going to come back defended. These people who are refugees are scared of retaliation, and people are going to have guns and they're going to come back defended. Insofar as the police don't want to abuse them for fear of them sparking violence back, they're not incentivized to abuse them. But secondly, as Vij said, relocating them successfully is done when people are likely to cooperate. And people are not likely to cooperate when you forcefully pull them outside of their houses. This is logistically harder and takes more time. These people are smart, they want to do this in successful ways. But the third thing is that loads of people are just willing to relocate. They hear that there's going to be a new prosperous community in which they actually have access to education and infrastructure because it's centralized. So they want to go. These people also love Paul Kagame. Paul Kagame is super popular and has been very successful in doing these types of things. So they trust the government, they're willing to relocate. Paul Kagame has incentives to do this properly. Secondly, on econ, they say that people are likely to go themselves and redevelop these places themselves. Firstly, how are they getting there in the first place? No mechanisms. How do they know where to go? How do they know where to centralize? How are they going to centralize and decide together what places they're going to live in? And two, where are they going? Specifically, if there's no centralized place where infrastructure is being redeveloped, how are we deciding where to redevelop? When you centralize resources, you get much more efficiency. This is very clear out of Vijay's speech. When you make one bank, many people can go to that one bank, as opposed to trying to have the resources to set up a bunch of tiny little banks in little different rural homesteads who don't have the resources to build them, or the knowledge to be able to, and the government infrastructure and apparatuses to be able to develop them properly. But also you need the infrastructure. You need roads to drive supply chains to one place. If you don't have this in different places, you can't set up. Their claim on aids is just you are going to get aid to different places that are dealt separately with different people. But hey, without roads, without infrastructure, how are you getting the aid efficiently to all these places? It's really hard to disperse aid into loads of different little places and understand properly the types of aid people need without getting the data from them, insofar as they're not together and you can't pull them. But also, as we've already said, Kagame is interested because of external perceptions, because he wants to re-establish a good government, to do this properly. And he has control over where the aid is being dispersed to, not these corrupt actors, which we're not even sure why they are corrupt. I'm going to talk about why violence gets worse with rural sprawls, particularly with militia. Then I'm going to do some ref and weigh against the idea of like spiritual care over your tribe. Why does violence get worse with rural sprawl? Vij already explains to you the claim on oversight. It's obviously structurally easier to get weaponry when nobody's looking over you if you're going through a bunch of different places as opposed to just through one road. Similarly, organizing little militias in little groups to attack villages nearby is a lot easier. What is the checking mechanism we have? One, we just have a perceived supervision, which psychologically makes you less inclined insofar as you know there's militias and police watching over you and making sure that you're not doing this when you're in one congregated place. But secondly, we have checking mechanisms. You can cut off supply lines. You can check roads if guns are being brought in to stop this type of militia. The secondly is the mechanism of hope. When you see that there are seeds of a new life, to separate from the fear and genocide that you've been living under, you get to go to school, you get businesses. These are indicators of things, of the government developing infrastructure that make you not want to go back to the old ways of genocide, that make you want to stay. When you're uncertain, you're alone and you're fearful and you're not talking to others, you're reactionary. One bullet can re-spark tensions. What do we think happens on their side of the house when you allow natural development to happen? It's likely to be segregated natural development. You are going to seek to avoid others, one, because you're fearful of the other group, but two, because there's stereotypes about these other groups, so you're going to obviously stay within your own ethnic group. Why does segregated development lead to more ethnic tensions? One, there's no pushback on hatred. When you're in an echo chamber with other people who are of your group, there's not going to be reasons to care or like the other group, so you can continue to exacerbate these ideas on hatred. But two, you see other villages as competition. You're going to want to fight against them. And then you militarize as defense in order to make sure that they don't fight you first, you fight them first. The end impacting of this is it's much more likely to lead to civil war. You're much more likely to engage with your little group and want to go beat up people elsewhere, it's much worse. Obviously, their counterfactual is losing. We don't want violence. We'd obviously rather have these economically centralized and socially integrated places. You get better rights on our side of the house. Why is this true? When you have people who are educated because they can actually go to one school that has a set of textbooks, people can collectivize, they can do peaceful protests, they can talk amongst each other on the rights that they actually want. This is how you get the great female rights in Rwanda that exist today. This is how you get the development of a great society that Rwanda exists. I'm going to engage on buy-in. They say that you don't trust your government. I contend what actually makes you distrust a government is seeing that they've had no attempts to reestablish after a genocide. You don't see them and you don't hear them. There's no external media telling you that they want you to do better. You don't understand that the government's doing anything and you don't see their efforts of rebuilding. Sure.
I really don't think we have to defend the Rwandan government building literally 0 schools anywhere on our side of the house.
Sure, Jaleelah, but if there's a school for 10 people, then how are they going to make enough schools for each of these people? Are they going to build roads between each little rural area? How are they going to get the money to build all of those roads? You obviously understand that when you have an efficient allocation of resources, it's much easier to get more people educated. Cool. The second thing they say, on no trust also, they say that you're likely to not participate in the government. Obviously, scattered homesteads don't participate in democracy because how are you getting to voting booths? How are you polling these people? How are you understanding and registering data on where all these people are? I'm going to now weigh over the idea on like your spiritual care of your particular community. First, this is an assertion that they need to prove. They cannot just say that people really care about the land they're on. This is asserted. I don't know why people do, and I don't know if this is empirically true. But obviously, proximate concerns of the uncertainty of violence when militias are more likely to exist, which we've certainly proven to you with rural sprawl, when they can actually weaponize themselves and fight, is much worse. Why? Death is more important than spiritual ties. During the Ukraine war, people polled citizens and asked them if they wanted the war to keep going. They said no, even though this meant that they're conceding their land and they're letting their land continue to be grabbed. They saw family members dying around them. They started starving and they would rather the war to have stopped because death is the worst option. We would rather prevent this. Very proud of it.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for a fantastic speech. I invite up the Member of Government here.
Online team singular. Please give POIs verbally. I think that's such. Okay. We're going to prove that most of these displacements were forced and that this is principally wrong, even if it brings about economic benefits or allegedly prevents random rural violence. First, why are the displacements forced? So OO has 3 alleged reasons why they're not mostly forced that I'm going to kind of respond to as I integrate this analysis. Their first reason is actually my reason why they are forced, and it's that people want to be seen as doing well. Officials want to be seen as achieving their goals and meeting their targets and getting the promotions and bringing honor to their family because they're high ranking, etc. Right? The problem is they are seen well if they do more relocations and not less relocations for the same amount of money. If they outcompete their peers in other cities, it pushes them, it drives them, it gives them the desire to do best. To get the most relocations possible. The thing is, OO kind of vaguely asserts like, oh, it will look bad if you kill people. But there is no taboo against doing small amounts of violence in post-genocide Rwanda. Most people are largely desensitized to this kind of violence. Most people probably saw entire villages massacred. If you're just doing the tiniest bit of violence, you're just like kind of nudging people with the butt of a gun, or you're shooting 1 person or 2 people, that's probably seen as a pragmatic sacrifice that is acceptable to make. There's no taboo where you're viewed as a cold-blooded murderer by the rest of society as soon as you do this, especially compared to the praise that you get from the government and the institutions that you've dedicated yourself to in exchange for doing this violence. So here is why it is cheaper to do more forcible relocations with the same amount of money given than non-forcible relocations, right? The first thing I want to say is that people who wanted to move to a bigger village or city or reskill or whatever, they would have done so by this point. Opening opposition says this isn't the case because there are coordination problems. There were no big villages that exist. The problem is, empirically, in nearby countries, and by nearby, I literally mean closer than Toronto and Ottawa are, there are big villages that people did move to from Rwanda. There are large populations of people who went to cities or went to larger villages in Rwanda because they wanted, in fact, these things. They wanted the security that there's going to be infrastructure in a big village for them to live to. And never gave you reasons why, going 5 hours to a different country versus 5 hours to a different province in your own country is different at all. So anyone who wanted to leave but was dissuaded by the lack of coordination problem or by the coordination problem already has left their tiny villages. Now, forcible relocation is incredibly easy for several reasons. First, small amounts of violence help you relocate entire villages, whereas you need large amounts of money to do the same thing. The reason for this is fear. If you shoot one single person who has, refused publicly to leave, to go to a new village and to accept their new job, you shoot them in the public square, guess what? You now get five families for free, baked into the deal as well. Because they see that and now they're like, fuck, well, I really like my home. I don't want to get shot. Bro, this fucking happened to my grandparents. You want to POI me and be like, this is ridiculous? Do it. No, you don't. Okay, so, right. Comparatively, you have to pay every single family probably quite large amounts to guarantee that they are going to listen to you, right? You either have to go and negotiate with a bunch of individual people, or you can do a few actions that push them out. The second reason is you have a monopoly on violence. You have just disarmed all of your ops. You have the guns that you need. You have the military forces that you need, etc. It's probably not that difficult to physically push them out. You can drag out the possessions that they care about, etc. These things are all quick, but you have to pay probably a lot of money to convince people to leave and go to new cities. Why is that? So now I'm going to do a tiny bit of analysis on why the cities suck for these people. The people who didn't want to leave, who hadn't already fled to, go do urban reskilling, are people who are specialized in farming their particular crops. And if they're not specialized in farming their particular crops, at minimum, they're familiar with their particular land, and they've built routines over years to efficiently farm that land. It's something that they do without thinking. It's something that, they don't require, intellectual labor, etc. to do. Often these people literally did not know how to read, and you're 42. You're not neuroplastic enough to immediately just spawn the skills to be a comp sci worker in the new city like OA wants you to. So since these people aren't able to get amazing kind of higher level jobs, since these people are taken away from their routine that brought them comfort, their routine that they knew how to do, and thrown into a new environment with basically no proven ability from opening opposition to learn these new skills to become these amazing intellectual workers, people don't want to fucking do that. You have to pay them a lot of fucking money to convince them to go take this risk to do this thing that they know, because they're not inherently stupid. They know start organs to 5 more people so that they can live. If you wanted this, you would go kill yourself and get your organs donated. So I think, given this, opening opposition says they have one piece of weighing, even though Vij said he would weigh. And it's money is good for people because resources help people get more things that they want. But the things that they want is the crucial thing there, right? Money is not enough for self-determination or happiness or whatever. You need resources, but you also need autonomy, i.e. decisions on how to use those resources, which goals to pursue to make yourself happy. And you also need guarantee that, or the belief that you can do it. Belief in yourself and your ability and your capabilities to move forward and whatnot. Yep.
Jaleelah, if they left in the first place, they left their routines and went elsewhere because they were afraid of violence. They have a revealed preference, obviously, to avoid violence at the
So the problem is actually 2 groups of people can exist, right? We have the group of people that already left because they feel like they can reskill, and we have the people who didn't leave because they don't feel like they can reskill and who need to be convinced to leave. 2 different groups. So second thing, resources are nothing without autonomy, etc. We should follow moral systems that give us simple rules that will lead us to live in a better society, right? We should not do immoral acts. We should regret immoral acts that violate kind of such a code. How do we make this decision? The way that every society in the world basically has decided is some variant of the golden rule. In general, we should not harm people. We should not infringe on their autonomy in ways that we would not enjoy. I should not hit you because I would not enjoy being hit, etc. Think to yourselves, judges. Annika too. What if I set up a prosperous community inside your mom's bedroom while she was gone? Huh? And then I prevented her from coming back in. You think about that intuition pump. You guys wouldn't enjoy destroy that. It is fucking wrong to steal things with people. It's wrong to shoot one person, instrumentalize them, turn them into nothing in order to convince other families to leave, which again, practically is how these fucking relocations are done, at least grandparents wise and stuff. So I think it's just like they say violence is worse with more rural sprawl. A couple of first direct response, no, it's not. Most of the militias were disarmed. Most of the militias were disarmed by the government, but there were also international bodies that came in and took the guns away from the people who were in the rural militias, etc. I'm not sure where they fucking are and what their incentive is to band together again, right? But even so, even if you believe maybe some violence would arise on the comparative, this is still a wrong and immoral action that was taken by the government. There is a distinction between taking an action and sitting back and something bad sort of happening in the future, right? You are not a murderer just because you haven't donated all your excess money to save people from malaria. So this is morally wrong. I don't gaff if it made the economy a little better, but I don't think it did because OO never proved the reskilling is successful. We're proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the
Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to.
You want my laptop?
No, it's okay. I just needed to check that I was aware of all the things they. Well, okay, for the online people, please do vocalize, or actually I can kind of see you honestly. Maybe don't vocalize, maybe just like wave at me and turn your camera on since I'm looking right at you. For the in-person people, also wave at me. There's no reason to vocalize unless I'm like getting close to 6 minutes and haven't taken a POI. Okay. Let's just get right into it. We got lots of things to say. So first I'm going to deal with CO, take them out of this debate, and then I will deal more comprehensively with OO and compare us probably while I'm doing that to opening government. So closing opposition says central planning, good. We love central planning. There are a lot of problems with this. First of all, their characterization of Rwanda as basically like Toronto, in which it's incredibly expensive to like build a home, is very unrealistic. These materials are probably cheap. They were legitimately, the form of aid that people received in these communities was like housing materials. We think that in the counterfactual world, those housing materials are given to individual people to rebuild, or to communities to rebuild their own rural farms, homesteads, whatever, or give them a grant if they want to, move into another city, to give people the autonomy when they're not being forced to move in a certain way. And okay, on why is central planning probably not so good? Well, first of all, it is probably the case that these are very dense communities now, right? Denser communities are more vulnerable to things like disease, keeping in mind that also people from rural areas are probably like not vaccinated, not exposed to a lot of pathogens. There is a serious risk of having high rates of transmissible communicable diseases in these places. Public health is very difficult to like develop infrastructure for. You have to have like clinics that are able to, first of all, test people for these types of things, know what the pathogen is. You have to have labs, you have to have biotech, and then you also have to be able to afford expensive medication to be able to mass distribute it. There's also a lot of pollution in cities. Waste management is expensive and difficult to do. So like, as soon as one stream gets polluted, or one water system gets polluted, the entire village has everyone falling ill, mass death. This is happening all over like a bunch of probably somewhat neglected villages that have ethnic tensions at the same time. It's also probably expensive to do this well. So most likely the way that what isn't expensive is housing materials. What is expensive is having actual public health infrastructure. So I think that it's more likely that the quality of life for these people is not going to be very good. High rates of disease, probably going to have poor infrastructure, and something more like a slum than a vibrant city, or even Toronto. Not that vibrant of a city, in my opinion. Okay. Homeless refugees are the counterfactual according to closing opposition. I don't understand why this is likely, why people are not given resources to rebuild their probably pretty cheap, wooden homes in their homesteads. Also, there are economic centers in neighboring cities in other countries. It seems CG or CO didn't listen to all the things Jaleelah told you about why there is, and I actually work in refugee law. I have clients who moved to neighboring cities if they wanted to and were able to upskill. So like young people, for example, who were still able to learn, advanced skills, who may have had some savings to be able to like attend university, for example, or a local college. These were people who did move and they had access to neighboring cities. Again, this debate is not from the perspective of Rwanda. There is still access to wealth for these people. Okay, centralized governments can take out loans more easily. I'm unclear why the government itself is more centralized just because there are central cities, like centralized city planning. They say you can get data. I'm not sure why you have the infrastructure developed to like, track the financial activity in these newly developed cities. The CO is really contingent on a very optimistic version of what this looks like. Okay, now getting into opening opposition. So I want to point out that, okay, opening opposition says people have guns, and so you don't want to violently displace someone who has a gun. Again, a lot of Jaleelah's material was about why this is likely to be done in a way that is violent and also the principled harms of like literally forcibly removing people, whether it is violent or not. Keeping in mind that also, to quote Vijay, a very smart man, money is as coercive as violence. So your move was probably really coercive still. If in your best case scenario, you paid people to sell their land, as Jaleelah told you with that POI that Vijay kind of skirted around and later said he would weigh on and then didn't, about ethnic violence. Or sorry, about Palestinians being being made to sell their land. Okay, why is it that there is going to be violence? So if the cops will just outgun these rural people, they know that they can do it. These rural people probably have like a rifle, to shoot someone who comes onto their land. They probably don't do that often. They probably are used to like shooting livestock and not people that much. Cops are trained, they are militarized. Opening government is smacking on the table, and I'm unclear why. There is a massive extent to which the like deterrence effect also that Jaleelah described of when as soon as you just see the cops shoot one person in your family or they drag out or kill one of your animals or whatever, everyone is likely to comply as a result of that. Sure, I'll take opening opposition.
The golden rule cannot be a principal framework because we put people in jail and have triage systems. It can be overridden for the common good, especially since nearby countries don't have infinite capacity for millions of refugees.
Okay, they don't have to have infinite capacity because, again, many people will choose to stay in their villages and continue to farm. As for the first thing about the golden rule, I mean, like probably a bad person to ask this to because I'm an abolitionist, but there are many reasons why prisons are morally wrong. Like, we do instrumentalize people and they actually create more crime. This is an empirical fact and you can look it up. Okay, it's important to understand that the expectation that these people might be violent or have guns is also part of the reason that these armed police will be reactive, right? It is unclear to me also how any of this squares with the analysis from opening opposition themselves that these people are cooperative, they want peace, especially with respect to the militias argument. So the argument about like inter-violence between people, they have this characterization of people as being cooperative and wanting peace, and yet they're also telling us that in the counterfactual, you're likely to have large amounts of ethnic violence, and that police in centralized communities are the only way to prevent this. Again, we told you that police are likely to be reactive, are likely to use the most efficient form of violence, which is normalized and desensitized at this point in these communities, and that therefore cops do not reduce violence in these cities, but also the movement of these people to these cities is likely, or these villages is likely to be very violent inherently. So I also want to point out, OG says that this is going to be done poorly because government officials will be corrupt and siphon aid. I don't think they explain why this is particularly likely. We tell you that government officials are probably chasing quick targets without sufficient knowledge. Technocrats prioritize efficiency over relationship building, but none of this actually matters, right? Because what is logically prior to everything else is the fact that these people are being forcefully removed from a place that they had every right to stay in. No amount of financial well-being is going to compensate for that. Proud to propose.
For stuff. Also, they're in person, which is better than me because I'm online. Okay, the call was as follows. We did not come to a consensus decision. We did consensus agree on CG taking the first. There was a 2-1 split for OO taking, it was 2-1 for OO taking the second, and then OG taking the third, and then CO consensus was fourth. So top half, I'll start with top half and how we saw this play out. Opening government gives some reasons as to why this policy is going to be done poorly. That there's some levels of corruption and inefficiency in the government, that people may not want to move, that they have ties to their land, that they're generally distrustful in the aftermath of a genocide, that they don't really want to move into these large centralized villages in which people from the other group that they hate might be there. Then they give a number of reasons as to why, when done this way, bad things will happen, right? Like you create breeding grounds for further ethnic conflict. You exacerbate, these kind of buy-in problems. You reduce buy-in to the government. People don't really believe in the project when you do it, execute it poorly. And generally, this is this is really bad. You don't get economic development because people need to kind of believe in the project and have some degree of trust and buy-in in order to engage economically, build businesses, etc. Opening opposition gives a number of reasons as to why they think this will be done well, as to why people aren't forcefully relocated, but generally are incentivized to move voluntarily, why these villages will be built well, and then gives a number of reasons about the positive benefits of that happening. You get economic development, you get a centralization of resources, economies of scale, all the good stock analysis on when you make things bigger, right? They also talk about violence and how violence comparatively is worse when it's decentralized. So it's easier to conduct smaller scale military operations. It's harder to kind of monitor decentralized groups of people living in small clusters of homesteads and make sure that they're not militarizing again, not taking up arms, and how and then there's kind of this clash on social contact theory about how OO claims that social contact theory is good and helps people like each other a bit more. OG claims that its contact is bad because of all the tensions after the genocide. The panel largely felt that most of the impacts coming out of top half were downstream of the initial clash, which is like, how is this done? Is this done well? Are you like people moving voluntarily to some degree with incentives? Is the government doing this in good faith, or are officials kind of corrupt? Are they forcing people to move against their will, resulting in this kind of degree of distrust, right? The level of the buy-in stuff from opening government also is like fairly downstream, because the counter from OO is like, if people see this as a genuine place of economic opportunity and a way to improve their lives, then there is more buy-in and there is more trust. Versus if people are forcefully relocated here, they don't really want to be there, there's going to be a lot more distrust, a lot less buy-in. This is where I think that the panel was split and there are disagreements. But 2 out of the 3 panel members felt that opening opposition provided a broadly a better explanation for why this is going to be done well. So the reasons we hear are, that there's conditional aid, there are checks and balances, people, generally have lots of incentives for this wanting to go well, that you have the whole world looking at them, because people just got out of a massive war, they really don't want conflict. I think like the degrees to which the panel bought this obviously varied among panel members. Some panel members like, yeah, this sounds like really solid reasoning. Me, I was like, this is okay. Another panel member was like, not so much. But that this was sufficient enough to explain why you're not going to have kind of like a strong forceful relocation. If you try to forcefully relocate people, then they will be violent and not cooperate with you, and that makes the entire project much harder. So incentives against violence. The reason why OG says this is going to be done poorly is they talk about that there's kind of a loss of political trust in the general environment, and attitudes and political sentiment after the genocide were quite poor. It gives us reasons why people wouldn't really trust the government. But we just felt like these were lacking in explanation and number compared to the OO reasons. So really the weighing here just ended up being that OO gave a broad number of reasons and explained them a bit better as to why this is going to be done well. Explained why you have an incentive against violence. Opening government's explanations started well in terms of explaining why there's reasons for distrust, but didn't really develop further down into the case, and we're kind of left at those initial assertions. Developed their assertions a bit more, countered back against some of OG's reasons as well. Given that this clash kind of determines all the downstream impacts, we felt like OO was already winning. But the last thing I'll mention here is that OO also has some comparative analysis. The comparative analysis that OO gives about like why violence gets worse when people live in decentralized homestead communities, we felt like existed independent of that clash, where it was harder to find substantial impacts from opening government that weren't downstream of the implementation clash. And so given that it was also hard to kind of determine who was winning the implementation clash really solidly, at least OO also has something else we can credit them independent of that. So that's the other reason that we gave them the win. Cool. Closing government. Closing government has two main contributions in this round. The first big contribution is an explanation of why relocation was done violently. And the panel as a whole agreed that the explanation, like both the analytical reasoning for why violence was like why officials, bureaucrats would resort to violence and why that was very convenient, and also just the like not just the analytical reasoning, but the explanatory process of that, like illustrating to us how that happened, in what ways that happened, why that made sense for people at the time, why people are desensitized to that kind of violence, we felt was just a lot more compelling, and was able to convince us that, you know, even if maybe there were good faith incentives in the government and people want to do this well, in the way that relocation was done, it was done often through violent means to coerce people to move. Then there's weighing on this principle as to why that's more important than the pragmatic impacts that come out of side opposition. The second contribution comes out in the whip, mainly in the whip. So part in the extension in which they talk about how people would end up kind of moving to larger villages anyways, and they had already done that prior to the program. I want to note that I do want to credit that this comes out of opening government. Like opening government does say that people will relocate in the long term anyways. The difference between opening government and closing government is opening government's claim is that people will relocate in the long term and it'll happen eventually. And the problem with this policy is that we're doing it too quickly. Opening opposition's counter to this is like in the long term, there's still incentives for why people wouldn't want to move. And also, if it happens in the long term, you miss all of the positive impacts from opening opposition that, you know, between like the point of this policy and the long term. Closing government's claim is different. They say that people already moved to villages nearby. They give an explanation for why these villages were easily accessible and characterizations of the incentives of individuals who had already moved, and then say the remaining people that were targeted by the policy in the debate are people who didn't want to move and often wouldn't have the skills or abilities to survive after relocation to a larger centralized village. So we thought this was better explained and justified, made realistic to the panel about how this happened and what it looked like, and also is distinct from the opening government claim in terms of like the time frame in which it happens. So we felt this was more effective in making parts of the opening opposition case more marginal and explaining why, you know, the additional margin they get of incentivizing people to move, even if it didn't happen through violent relocation as per their main argument, those people often weren't able to find the kind of economic prosperity and opportunity in cities that opening opposition claimed. Then the second layer of mitigation / pushback, right, is what comes out of the whip speech, in which they talk about how just the capacity to build large developed cities in which you can take advantage of all of these like mechanisms of economies of scale was limited, and also that when you put people in large populations together, you create new problems associated with density, pollution, disease, right? It requires good waste management systems, disease treatment, etc. Given that you create these new problems that maybe, you know, these centralized villages don't actually have the infrastructure or resources to defend against, these can be unique harms. So given this mitigation from closing government, we felt that the impacts from opening opposition start to get squeezed thinner and thinner. And now from opening opposition, it's no longer people die versus people find like economically prosperous lives. And now it's more like the people, like a lot of people moved already, and the remaining people that moved, maybe life got better in some ways, but also maybe didn't get better in other ways, made it a lot easier to weigh the principle of violence from closing government over the pragmatic benefits from opening opposition. So even if we agree with opening opposition's weighing of like, you know, like death is more important than your ties, or like that, you know, just getting people some basic economic guarantees so that they can access autonomy, like all the weighing from opposition in terms of why economic outcomes are important, becomes less effective when your impacts start to become more and more marginal based on the mitigation. Great. Closing opposition. Closing opposition is two main arguments. One argument is about the effective dispersal of aid. The second argument is about kind of long-term economic development. So I think our first issue with closing opposition was just that a good, like not all of the material, but good chunks of the material we felt were already present in opening opposition, right? So opening opposition talks about long-term economic development, a lot of the ideas about centralization, efficient allocation of resources, like these are things that we already get out of opening opposition. Not to say that closing opposition doesn't add valuable analysis to this, right? About regulations and stability and predictability, the roles of central banks and whatnot. These are all things that I think are new and to some extent valuable, but it's unclear how much this is really changing the core impact, which is that you create environments for long-term economic growth. We believed it out of opening opposition. I guess we believe it at a later stage as well from closing opposition, but like to what extent this is improving the point so much that it's changing the debate, we're not super sure about. The material on aid, there's also a bit of mention from aid on opening opposition, but our issue, I guess this is a good way to talk about the other independent issue, like independent from OO, the issues that we had from CO. The aid argument, it was like, it makes sense why this creates scalar benefits in terms of the effectiveness and dispersion of aid. So we do agree, like all of the analysis contributes to, yes, aid can be dispersed more effectively, and it's easier to have accountability measures. The question we had was like, what is the margin on aid dispersion, right? So like, why, like we get that it's like it can be maybe more difficult to move aid around, it takes more resources to disperse aid around, but like why does that mean that people end up starving or without, or a significant part of the population ends up without access to aid on government side when people are kind of like staying in homesteads, especially given that the aid doesn't seem to be super complex or difficult to administer in nature. Like the comparative of like not having these additional benefits of aid dispersion, and it doesn't seem the TLDR in simple language, like it doesn't seem so bad. And so that's why we're not really clear, like this is a benefit, but like to what degree and what impact does this have in the debate that we can weigh against other teams. On long-term development, this becomes a lot more susceptible to the criticisms of Gov in terms of like people end up moving to these kind of like larger cities anyways, or larger centralized villages. And the reason why is because like a lot of the additional analysis provided by closing opposition on long-term development is kind of like the world that this takes place in is one in a city that is like you have central banks and you have like financial infrastructure and you have like really just a lot of core infrastructure for living that I think requires a higher this is just like a bit higher burden than opening opposition's material, of not to say that it can't happen or it doesn't happen, but given that it's like requires us to believe that these aren't just like centralized villages, but end up kind of being almost like cities that are fairly developed. Why isn't that something that just ends up happening anyways in the long-term horizon that opening government sets up, right? And then closing opposition has their own engagement, which is like actually when in the ways that you set these up initially, they're more likely to look like slums because of the nature in which you move people, and because they're the people that you do forcefully relocate often don't have the skills to actually, like make a living for themselves in the city, right? So because it's higher burden, it is more susceptible to the strategies that both opening government and closing government have with dealing with this argument about economic development. And also, it is not clear, like independent of the engagement from Gov, it's not clear how much better it is than the arguments about economic development from opening opposition. And so because both of those arguments, it's kind of like not sure how much to buy them, how much are they adding to the debate, slash they've been refuted by the Gov teams in ways that were more like the Gov teams were more able to effectively refute your arguments than they were opening opposition. You end up taking the fourth. Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
The seat.
Okay. Is the OA being recorded?
I guess.
Yeah, you can revoke your consent after if you want to. Or you can revoke your consent.
No,
Perfect.
that's cool. I don't mind at all. Okay, let's go ahead and begin. So first, let's cover the decision, and then we'll go through general comments and so on and so forth. So we did not come to a unanimous decision. The call is as follows. It's opening opposition in the first, closing government in the second, opening government in the third, closing opposition in the fourth. The split was opening government in the first. So closing opposition, unfortunately, is unanimous in the fourth. The rest is a split decision. Okay, let's go ahead and begin. So I'll start with some general thoughts. I think the first question is, this debate is about settling refugees, and it seems like a lot of the analysis from many teams at points in the round is kind of arguing about like why central planning is good without the context of specifically like the things that are talked about in the info slide. The other question is a lot of the time we're talking about relocation as if the people kind of have been there the entire time, as opposed to relocation in the context of many people who are probably in the process of remigrating into the country at varying degrees at a varying pace. So I think some of these things kind of muddle some of the way in which we conceptualize the round, or at least I'm conceptualizing many of the arguments. And the other question is how the specific Rwandan context of the round plays in. I think it's maybe just the case people don't know too much about this period of history and stuff, but I think that context could have really elevated many of the arguments and probably unlocked new avenues for back-half teams and new arguments, that kind of thing. Let's talk about opening government first. We'll go through the teams chronologically, and I'll talk about all the splits as they come up. So opening government have a few arguments that obviously we kind of disagreed about how compelling they were. So let's start with I think there are kind of two pushes. One is to say that the government is going to be bad for a bunch of reasons. Basically, that there's incentives for the government to want to push things very quickly so they can look good and get the kind of rewards that are hinted at in the info slide. And the second is the counterfactual to this, that if we don't do these kind of things, that's going to be better because we can achieve many of the economic benefits of like centralizing of infrastructure and labor without the need to push anybody or do it so quickly, such in a way that it's maybe inefficient or coercive or leads to kind of conflict among the people who are living with one another. I'll talk about how this compares to opening opposition because I think opening opposition fairly questions how probable this counterfactual is and to what degree it can be accomplished at the economic scope that they want it to. They bring up that there are just a lot of reasons. First of all, that many people might cooperate and that this might be done well. There's a kind of push that, there are reasons officials are going to do things well. And I think particularly that there's just not a capacity to bring people. It's brought up at deputy that maybe people don't know where they're meant to be going, that maybe there's just not the ability to actualize the funding at the scale you kind of want it to be actualized to. And we feel that the panel as a whole feels these are broadly enough to really muddy the extent to which opening government can prove economic benefits here. So the question is what we're meant to weigh up. And I think opening government doesn't really weigh the points on violence enough. I think opening opposition also clashes well on violence and probably wins the clash on violence there as well. But it's just to say that the counterfactual isn't built up enough for me to believe that it's true, given opening opposition explains that there are a lot of quite clear benefits you have when you centrally plan these kinds of things. You have roads that go places, you have hospitals, you have banks, this kind of stuff. So that's why opening opposition is beating opening government. Opening opposition I don't need to repeat the arguments. Closing government, let's bring into the round. Closing government, I think, is a little bit of a tricky team to place because I think they're making two contributions that interact kind of weirdly with opening government. And let me talk about kind of what I feel they are. The first, I think, is a relatively persuasive analytical claim, which unlocks some of the state violence arguments that government teams here are trying to argue about, particularly basically just analyzing why officials have the incentive and capacity to do things in a bad way, talking about why it's the path of least resistance for them to undertake violent initiatives. And that means, because they're competing with one another, that they're going to do that. And then I think some weighing on why the violence that's committed is particularly important and meaningful, which I think is fairly reasonable weighing. Why do we feel that this is enough to take them over opening government? I think it's because that, for one, both of the teams are impacting part of their case to violence. And I explained I'm quite unsure what the margin opening government has on the economic side of their case, because I'm a little bit unsure how the state has the ability to, free market capitalism their way into the kind of economic like zones that opposition is talking about. So if we kind of discount that part of the opening government case and we look at the ethnic conflict part of opening government's case, I think that the way in which they're accessing opening the both government teams are accessing violence is distinct from one another. In closing government, it's arguing that the state will enact this violence actively because it's the easiest thing for low-level officials to do. And opening government talks that this will be an accident of state misconduct. The reason we feel that closing government is stronger is because closing government weighs why the kind of violence that's being done here is a particularly harmful and malicious form of violence. And so therefore we can decide the government bench comparison on that clash. Why are they not beating opening opposition? We feel that opening opposition, first of all, I think has benefits to violence that aren't really clashed very much with by the closing government team. And I think as well, opening opposition is accessing a fairly compelling case here on economic benefits that, even though I think it's quite fair what closing government's pointing out, I think I would have liked to see maybe some more mitigation for what opening opposition's pointing out. And the other thing is opening opposition POI's closing government to ask in the whip what the why there's a unique necessity of doing this, given the inability of other countries to meet the demands of refugees. I think this is somewhat poorly responded to. And so if I'm wondering the scope of impacts both teams are getting, also, one other thing on this clash is I think opening opposition gives some reasons that officials are not going to be as malicious as closing government has. And so I think ultimately the characterization I get of officials is a little bit unclear, given closing government doesn't disprove in a unique way to opening government or anything why the official analysis from opening opposition is wrong. So I'm a little bit unsure how much officials are going to behave, like how many of them are going to behave the way closing government says, how many of them are going to behave opening opposition says. Closing government I think could have clashed a little bit more clearly there. And so given opening opposition has impacts that are also beyond the economic harms, I think that the scope of impact opening opposition has is fairly larger. Talking about closing opposition then, this was a difficult team to place, and I was initially a little bit more bullish on the case than we wound up being after the deliberation. I think the main issue is that many of the claims closing opposition makes are a little bit derivative, particularly I think of the deputy speaker for opposition. And I think that closing opposition does have some new content, but I think many of their new content is not quite so robust or not quite so compelling. So closing opposition has, I think, a few different contributions just on why centralization of economic development is a very good thing. I think there's some arguments on, how this makes it easier to distribute things. This is where I feel it's a little bit derivative of deputy. I think a lot of their responsiveness to the government bench is also a little bit derivative of things we heard from deputy. And that means it's a little difficult to see why they're independently of the analysis opening opposition is providing, defeating the government bench. I do think there are meaningful new contributions, like, for example, the points on the ability of aid institutions and international organizations to calibrate and set up permanent systems on the ground and develop touch points with people and ensure they're giving out aid in the right way and giving kind of building materials, this kind of thing. So the reason I think that they're losing out to opening opposition is the derivativeness point. The reason I think they're losing out to closing government is that if we look at the way both back half teams engage with each other, and I think there's unfortunately not a lot of direct engagement from either back half teams against one another. In closing opposition, it's largely a way against the moral push. It's to give alternative intuitions that principally we shouldn't value, the absoluteness of moral principles and this kind of thing. But I don't feel closing government is dependent on the moral principle weighing. It's also dependent on just the harm that their mechanisms on state enacted violence are doing to people, and that state enacted violence is fairly bad. So I think there's not clear push on that claim, and so the margin that closing opposition is proving the economic development argument is therefore not as quite important as the margin closing government is proving on state enacted violence. I think that the problem then with the long diagonal is much of closing opposition's responsiveness to opening government's case is not unique. So it's kind of repeated from responses that were given to opening opposition. And unfortunately, that means that they don't have a lot of direct responsiveness and clash to defeat opening government on their own standing. So I think even though there are a lot of ideas from closing opposition that are interesting, I'm not sure they're moving the case from opening opposition forward all that much. I'll go ahead and conclude the oral adjudication there. If people have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. Otherwise, I encourage you all to get lunch and have best of luck in round 5. If you want to ask me for personal feedback or something,